He was just taking out the trash behind the bowling alley. Regular night, no argument, no warning. And then boom, one shot. Just like that, a man who served his country was face down in the parking lot, gone before the paramedics could even show up. The crazy part is that it wasn't even the first time. It wasn't random either. To understand what really happened on that cold December night, you have to go back to a time when a crew that started as a car club ended up on a mission that had nothing to do with cars. The story starts way before the bullets and graffiti, back when Canoga Park was still known as Owens Mouth, a quiet farming town tucked in the southwest corner of the San Fernando Valley. We're talking 1930s, long before gang injunctions, long before turf wars, and way before Canoga made the news for all the wrong reasons. Back then, Latino farm workers in the area weren't looking to bang. They were just trying to survive because life on that end of the valley wasn't sweet. Work was backbreaking, racism was open, and cops didn't always show up when you called. So a group of young Mexican-American men came together, not to cause trouble, but to look out for one another. They called themselves a social club. It wasn't deep, just a way to stick together in a town that didn't really want them. But time changes everything. By the mid-50s, Canoga Park wasn't just farmland anymore. Aerospace jobs moved in, so did the 101 freeway, and the area slowly morphed into LA suburbia. Along with that came the rise of car culture. That little social club turned into a car club with lowriders, souped-up Chevys, weekend cruises down Sherman Way. Nothing criminal, at least not yet. Then the mid-70s hit and heroin started creeping through the valley. Then came coke, then meth and guns weren't just for show anymore. Slowly, that same group, now mostly the sons and nephews of the original members, shifted into something else, something way more serious. They called themselves Canoga Park, Alabama. Alabama, after the street that ran through their side of town. And while some still rocked cars, more of them were now repping the neighborhood on foot, holding corners, and getting into beefs that didn't end with fistfights. By the end of the decade, it was official, and CPA was no longer a club. It was a gang, a full-blown, boots-on-the-ground, turf-holding barrio crew. And what started as protection had started to flip. The hunted were slowly becoming the hunters. Canoga Park sits on the west end of the San Fernando Valley, boxed in by money on three sides: Woodland Hills to the south, Chatsworth up north, and West Hills on the edge. Drive 10 minutes in the right direction, and you'll pass country clubs, gated homes, and kids walking with iPads. But tucked between those zip codes is a stretch of apartment blocks, liquor stores, and chain-link fences. That's where CPA called home. CPA didn't just exist in Canoga Park, they claimed it. In fact, their turf stretched roughly 4 to 5 square miles, bounded by Roscoe Boulevard, Vinoan, Topanga Canyon, and Winnetka Avenue. Inside that square, there are old apartment buildings packed tight, graffiti that never stayed clean, and families trying to make rent on service jobs and night shifts. It was the kind of neighborhood where the same couch could sit on the curb for 3 weeks and no one would move it. Not because nobody cared, but because nobody wanted to get caught. At the heart of it all sat Lanark Park. To most of the city, it was just another public rec center, basketball court, playground, picnic tables. But on the block, Lanark was CPA's HQ. That was the meetup spot and the place where business got handled. Whether that meant baggies, conversations, or keeping an eye on who's coming in and who's trying to slide through unnoticed. By the mid-80s, CPA was deep to the point that LAPD reports estimated around 500 members, with maybe 100 of them really active. And it wasn't all just young heads. Some members had uncles, cousins, even dads who'd repped the name years before. In certain families, CPA wasn't just a gang, it was a legacy. But here's where things get complicated. Even with all that history, CPA wasn't always on some racial hate stuff. Back in the day, it was more about turf, pride, and survival. The lines were drawn by streets and cliques, not skin tone. That would change, but not right away, because something was brewing. And by the time it boiled over, Black families in Canoga Park would realize that the rules had shifted in a way that wasn't favorable. Before CPA became a headline for hate crimes, they were already knee-deep in the type of street business that had the valley hot long before it made the news. By the mid-80s, their hustle had shifted fully into the criminal lane, and they weren't small-time either. These dudes were pushing serious weight, meth, crack, sometimes even coke, while also racking up charges for auto theft, armed robbery, and burglary. Their territory wasn't just turf, it was an open-air enterprise. Glen Corner, a strip mall near Glen and DeSoto, quietly became a well-known spot for dope transactions. To the casual eye, it looked like your everyday rundown shopping center. But to locals and law enforcement, it was a base of operation where hand-to-hand deals happened in daylight. CPA also had a thing for boosting cars. They were known for swiping Hondas and Toyotas, stripping them fast, and either selling parts or flipping the whole ride. In one case, they even managed to jack an off-duty LAPD officer's personal car from a residential block in Reseda. That hit was when the department really started clocking them heavy. Still, through the 90s and early 2000s, their violence wasn't explicitly racial. It was gang beefs, business beefs, or turf disputes. They were known to go at it with Southside Reseda, a Mexican gang just a couple miles out. Shootouts popped off from time to time, but the targets were usually affiliated. One example, on August 11, 2004, a drive-by sparked by territorial tensions left Jose Carlos dead and another man injured. Witnesses later identified Joel Castañeda, a CPA member, as the shooter. He ended up with 50 years to life for first-degree murder and attempted murder. So yes, CPA had a reputation, but at that point, it was still the kind of reputation that came with gang life. Brutal, yes, but not yet personal for civilians. That changed soon enough because when it came to gang rivalries, CPA didn't have 100 enemies. They weren't like those cliques stacked against 10 other barrios. Their situation was a little different, more isolated. In fact, LAPD once noted they were one of the most cut-off gangs in LA County, with only one direct rival gang, Southside Reseda, within a 2-mile radius. But that didn't mean there wasn't smoke. Southside Reseda, also known as Southside Reseda 13, controlled turf stretching from Victory Boulevard to the 101 freeway between Wilbur and White Oak. Their presence overlapped just enough with CPA's edges to spark consistent friction. The beef wasn't just talk either. It turned bloody more than once. The 2004 shooting of Jose Carlos wasn't the only hit that happened over that line. According to court records, CPA cars were seen rolling past Reseda Park more than once, flashing signs, mad dogging, and circling like they were looking for a response. But gang beef was expected, but what wasn't expected was the way CPA started moving in the years that followed. It's important to note that most of the conflicts back then still followed the unofficial rules of gang warfare. You had to be affiliated and be in the game. And if you weren't, most of the time, you got left alone. That line started to blur somewhere around 2006. CPA's internal structure wasn't publicly documented the way some other crews were. But by then, a few names kept coming up. Guys like Johnny Aguilar and Joel Castañeda had already done time, and others were coming up behind them. The older homies were calling shots, but the younger ones were making a name through aggression. Some of them weren't just chasing rivals anymore, they were chasing fear. And that's when the targeting shifted and there was no more checking for tattoos or asking where you from. Sometimes it was enough for a person to be black and walking on the wrong side of Lanark Street, or driving through the valley late, or even standing at a payphone. What started as gang beef started turning into something else entirely, and the neighborhood felt the shift before the rest of the city even knew what was coming. By 2006, CPA's violence had taken on a different tone. It wasn't just about corners or rival crews anymore. It started to look like a campaign, a racial one. And this shift didn't happen in the shadows. People on the block saw it, officers noted it, and the graffiti started spelling it out before the bullets even flew. CPA members began tagging walls with NK, a code that stood for N-word killer. Some spots in the valley even carried tags that read 187 on all N-words. These weren't warnings aimed at rival sets. These were messages to everyday black folks who lived in or passed through CPA-controlled territory. It wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't about self-defense. Some law enforcement sources believe the shift may have been influenced by orders from inside prison. Allegedly, the Mexican mafia, known as La M, had been pushing for Latino gangs in Southern California to drive out black residents from certain neighborhoods. Whether CPA received direct instruction or not, what happened in Canoga Park during that time matched the same patterns seen in Highland Park, Azusa, and parts of South LA. Black residents were being pushed out through intimidation, physical assaults, and eventually fatal shootings. And it escalated so fast that between July 2006 and early 2007, there were at least a dozen documented shootings in Canoga Park where black civilians were targeted. In 9 of those 12 incidents, racial slurs were shouted before the trigger was pulled. The victims weren't gang members, weren't slanging dope, and weren't involved in any street business. Most of them were simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and in CPA's eyes, the wrong color. At this point, fear began to spread, not just among Black families, but across the broader community. Schools near Canoga Park began adjusting evening programs, and neighbors who used to let their kids ride bikes after dinner started keeping them indoors. People began asking, if this wasn't gang warfare anymore, what exactly was it? It didn't take long for the violence to move from whispers and warnings to citywide concern. By the fall of 2006, LAPD started noticing a clear pattern. CPA was aggressively targeting Black individuals, often without any provocation, and the attacks weren't isolated. On August 26, 2006, Nixon Gills, a 19-year-old running back who had just moved from Florida, was shot in the neck, shoulder, and eye while standing outside his Canoga Park apartment. He had just played in a preseason scrimmage for Pierce College and had stepped outside to call his mother and tell her about how well it went. A shotgun blast ended that call and nearly ended his life. Nixon survived, but he lost vision in his left eye, underwent 4 surgeries, and never played football again. The shooting wasn't linked to any beef or personal dispute. Nixon wasn't affiliated with any gang. According to both Nixon and police investigators, he was simply a young Black man living in a neighborhood CPA now viewed as theirs alone. By October, reports of racial slurs being spray painted on garages and alley walls doubled. Some of them had threats attached like "move out" or "get smoked." Other residents came forward to report being followed or harassed. One mother said her 14-year-old son was nearly jumped at a corner store just for walking home with a backpack. The community had seen gang activity before, but this wasn't that. This was methodical, targeted, and clearly racial. And by early 2007, even LAPD officially classified some of the CPA shootings as hate crimes. What made things worse was that many of the victims were outsiders, students, workers, or new transplants with no clue about the tension. They walked into it blind, unaware that the rules in Canoga Park had shifted. It wasn't just about not repping colors. Now it was about being Black. Period. At this point, the city began to take notice, and LAPD's Rampart Division assigned a task force to specifically track hate-related gang violence in the valley. But for Black families already living near Canoga Park, that shift came a little too late. The damage was already being done, and CPA wasn't slowing down. On the evening of August 26, 2006, 19-year-old Nixon Gills stepped outside his apartment complex in Canoga Park to make a phone call. He had just finished football practice with his new college team, Pierce College, and wanted to tell his mom back in Florida how it went. It was a regular moment for any student athlete, one of those quiet in-between scenes that don't usually make the news, but this one would. As Nixon stood outside, 2 young Latino males approached, one of them carrying a sawed-off shotgun. There was no conversation, no warning, and no demand for money. According to witnesses, and later confirmed in court, they said something under their breath, something that sounded like a slur, and then fired. The shotgun blast tore through Nixon's face and shoulder. He collapsed on the pavement, bleeding from his eye socket and struggling to breathe. Neighbors called 911, and LAPD officers arrived within minutes. Nixon was rushed into emergency surgery and somehow survived, but his left eye was gone. The pellets had caused permanent nerve damage to his face, and his football career ended right there on the asphalt. Police didn't find drugs, weapons, or any gang links on Nixon. He wasn't a local, didn't grow up in the area, and didn't know CPA by name. All he knew was that he moved into an affordable apartment complex in a neighborhood that looked decent on the surface. Later investigations would link the shooting directly to Canoga Park, Alabama. It wasn't mistaken identity, and not even gang retaliation. It was, plain and simple, a race-based attack. And Nixon's case wasn't the only one, but it was part of a wave. What made his story stand out, though, was how visible it became. News outlets picked it up. The image of a young Black athlete, clean-cut, college-bound, and nearly killed while calling his mother, hit a nerve across the city. But for CPA, this wasn't the climax. It was just the beginning of a darker chapter. Just a few weeks after Nixon's shooting, another incident pushed CPA further into the spotlight. And this time, the whole thing was caught on tape. On the afternoon of June 15, 2007, two black teenage boys were helping their aunt move out of a house on Lanark Street. Nothing shady, no gang signs, no shouting, just regular family business on a weekday afternoon. According to court documents, the teens were loading boxes into a truck when a group of Latino males pulled up in a car and got out. Within seconds, fists started flying. One of the boys was hit in the face and thrown to the ground, while the other was stomped and kicked repeatedly. The attackers shouted racial slurs throughout the assault, words like monkey and go back to Africa. The entire attack was captured by a nearby surveillance camera, and the footage, once reviewed by LAPD, left no room for spin. There was no back and forth, no escalation, and the teens didn't provoke anything. It was clear that the violence was immediate and one-sided. Investigators quickly identified two suspects, 23-year-old Johnny Aguilar and 20-year-old Francisco Vasquez, both known CPA affiliates with prior arrests. The footage became a key piece of evidence in court, and both Aguilar and Vasquez were charged with felony assault and hate crime enhancements. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized that the attack was racially motivated and entirely unprovoked. Witnesses from the neighborhood backed that up, stating that CPA had been checking black residents more aggressively over the past year, and that intimidation was now a regular thing. In August 2008, both men were convicted. Aguilar received a 10-year sentence, while Vasquez got 7. Though they weren't the highest-ranking members of CPA, the case sent a message that the city was finally paying attention. Still, convictions didn't slow the pattern. If anything, the violence started getting more surgical, less beatdowns, more bullets. And by the end of the year, CPA would carry out the killing that would make headlines across the entire state. It wasn't a teenager this time, or a new resident, or a student. It was a Navy veteran, a father of 5, and someone whose only mistake was showing up to work. On the night of December 22nd, 2008, James Champ was doing something he'd done countless times before, taking out the trash behind Canoga Park Bowl where he worked as a cook. It was just past 10 p.m. The night was quiet and most of the staff had already gone home. James stepped into the back lot with a plastic bag in hand, headed toward the dumpster, unaware that a car had just rolled into the alley behind him. According to witness accounts and court records, a small sedan slowed behind the bowling alley. Inside were 4 members of Canoga Park, Alabama: Richard Bordelon, Francisco Vasquez, Juan Carlos Pantoja, and Anthony Gonzalez. They weren't looking for a rival. They weren't there to settle a score. When they spotted James, alone, black, unarmed, they made a decision. Bordelon, sitting in the passenger seat, rolled down the window and fired once with a shotgun. The blast hit James in the chest, and he collapsed instantly. Security footage showed the car speeding off moments later, and employees found James slumped behind the building and called 911. Paramedics arrived, but it was too late as he was pronounced dead at the scene. James Champ was a 48-year-old Navy veteran, a father of 5 who had served his country, kept his head down, and worked 2 jobs to support his kids. According to co-workers, he never got involved in street stuff, didn't drink, and didn't hang out. He clocked in, did his shift, and went home. His murder shook the community, not just because of how senseless it was, but because it confirmed something a lot of folks had feared. CPA wasn't just threatening anymore, they were executing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong because nothing was stolen and no words were exchanged. It was a straight-up racial hit, and for the LAPD, this was the moment that forced them to act differently. By the time James Champ was laid to rest, LAPD had already connected the dots. His killing was the final link in a series of shootings and assaults that painted a clear picture. Canoga Park, Alabama, was no longer just a street gang. They were operating more like a paramilitary crew on a racial purge. But if the signs were there, the official response had taken too long. The LAPD's gang unit had been monitoring CPA since the late 90s. Back in 2002, they had issued a gang injunction against the group, creating a 4.65-mile restricted zone and banning CPA members from gathering in public within those boundaries. That move helped reduce overt gang activity for a while, but it didn't stop the violence. CPA just moved quieter, more calculated. Following Champ's murder, detectives from the West Valley Division worked with the city attorney's office to pursue a broader crackdown. In 2010, The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office brought a multi-defendant indictment against key CPA members under charges that included hate crimes, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Richard Psycho Bordelon, the shooter in the Champ case, was tried separately. Prosecutors laid out surveillance footage, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. The racial motive was clear. Bordelon was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances for committing a hate crime. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Francisco Vasquez, Anthony Gonzalez, and Juan Carlos Pantoja were also convicted in connection to the crime. Each received decades-long sentences under various charges, including conspiracy and gang enhancements. By then, CPA's leadership was fractured, and dozens of members had already been swept up in prior cases. And while they never vanished completely, their ability to operate openly was finally cut down. The murder of James Champ didn't just mark the end of an era for CPA, it forced the city to confront the racial dimension of gang violence in LA, something it had long tried to ignore. But for the families affected, those convictions didn't bring peace because the trauma didn't stop just because the shooters were behind bars. By 2010, LAPD had already built a pattern of racially motivated violence around Canoga Park, Alabama. But the case that sealed it even further came from a failed shooting that spun into chaos and ended with one of the gang's own lying dead in the street. On February 21st, 2010, two black brothers were driving through Reseda, a neighborhood just east of Canoga Park. It was around 10 p.m., and they had just picked up food and were headed home. That's when a Toyota sedan began following them aggressively. Inside were four CPA members: Francisco Vasquez, Anthony Gonzalez, Richard Bordelon, and Michael Cardenas. According to LAPD reports, Vasquez was in the passenger seat and fired a shotgun at the brothers' vehicle. Miraculously, the gun jammed and not a single shot went off. The brothers, realizing what was happening, immediately floored it. A high-speed chase followed through city streets, topping speeds of nearly 100 miles per hour. Luckily, the chase did not last long. As the Toyota sped through a red light at Tampa Avenue and Roscoe Boulevard, it collided violently with another vehicle. The impact sent the CPA car spinning into a pole, and Michael Cardenas, who was sitting in the back seat, was killed instantly, while others sustained injuries but survived. When officers arrived, they found the shotgun used in the attempted hit, along with gang paraphernalia and communications that linked the group to CPA. The surviving suspects were arrested on the spot, and later prosecutors revealed that the four men had gone out that night with a plan to target random black civilians. The motive was consistent with CPA's ongoing hate campaign, and their prior involvement in the Champ and Gilles cases gave even more weight to the charges. In the end, Gonzalez and Vasquez received life sentences. The driver, Pantoja, who had survived previous charges, was also convicted and sentenced to over 65 years in prison. For law enforcement, this case showed the recklessness of CPA's actions. For the community, it showed that even when their plans failed, people still died. Once the trials were over and the media coverage faded, the real work began for the community that had lived in the shadow of CPA for years. Healing doesn't come easy when fear has been part of your daily routine. When you've had to explain to your kids why they can't ride their bikes past a certain corner, or why a neighbor's garage still has slurs spray painted across it, even after 3 attempts to paint it over. Many black families who could afford to leave Canoga Park did just that. For those who stayed, life was never quite the same. Even after major convictions and the breakdown of CPA's upper ranks, the stigma lingered. Some residents said they still avoid Atlantic Park, even during daylight hours. Others kept their heads down and hoped the new generation wouldn't pick up where the last one left off. But there were others that did something more than staying quiet. Local churches, community centers, and activists stepped up in the months following James Champ's murder. Vigils were held not only for him, but for all the victims of CPA's hate-fueled violence. His family, in particular, pushed for public awareness about racially motivated gang crimes, calling out both the gang and the slow-footed response from authorities. Latino residents in Canoga Park also began speaking out, and many were quick to clarify that CPA did not represent the community at large. Some even testified in court, while others joined neighborhood councils and parent groups to advocate for unity and safety. Over time, the neighborhood changed with more surveillance, more after-school programs, and more pressure on landlords to report gang activity. It wasn't a miracle fix, but it was a start. And while Canoga Park is no longer the epicenter of gang-fueled racial violence it once was, the memories still run deep. Because when a neighborhood becomes a target zone, it doesn't forget, not even when the shooters are long gone. The story of Canoga Park, Alabama isn't just about gang violence. It's about how unchecked hate can quietly build until it explodes into everyday lives. From a car club to a racial terror crew, their legacy left scars on an entire neighborhood. The victims weren't soldiers in any war. They were students, workers, fathers, and neighbors. And while the headlines have faded, the impact hasn't, because some stories don't end when the gunshots stop, they just stop being told.